You've probably heard of Moses and his story. He was an ancient Egyptian who killed an Egyptian after beating him over the head with a rock because he was mistreating one of his people. To escape persecution in Egypt, he fled to Midian, where he lived for 40 years until God spoke to him out of a burning bush, telling him it was time to go back to Egypt to lead his people, the Israelites, out of slavery and into freedom. But Pharaoh wouldn't let them go. So God performed 10 plagues upon Egypt, like turning water into blood, causing frogs to spawn across the land, covering the ground in boils, and even killing every firstborn son in Egypt, except those marked with lamb's blood above their door, which symbolized Jesus Christ shedding his blood for us on the cross. Eventually, Pharaoh relented and allowed the Israelites to leave. But then he had a change of heart and assembled his army to chase them down. As the Israelites ran away, Moses held up his staff, and God parted the Red Sea so they could escape on dry land. And when the Egyptians got too close, God caused the waters to come crashing down on them, drowning Pharaoh and his entire army. And that's how Moses parted the Red Sea. Okay, I know what you're thinking. When will this guy ever learn? I mean, dude, you have been chased by an army all your life. Why didn't you just listen to God and free your people right away instead of waiting till the last second? And I get it. It seems dumb. But here's the thing. We don't really know why Moses waited so long to do what God told him to do. The Bible tells us that God gave Moses the ability to perform miracles and be supernaturally protected whenever he followed God's instructions. But it doesn't say anything about God giving Moses the ability to control the speed of the plot. If anything, it says that God worked through human weakness, which means that Moses, like all of us, was prone to procrastination. Think about it. How many times have you been putting something off and something reminded you, hey, you need to do that thing you've been avoiding? And you were like, oh yeah, I completely forgot. I gotta do that thing. And then you do it. And then you wonder, why did I wait so long to do that thing? Well, this is what happened to Moses. He knew he was supposed to free his people, but he kept putting it off. And as the story goes, God would work through his weaknesses and the weaknesses of others to get the job done anyway. Like there was this one time when God told Moses to go back to Pharaoh and demand the Israelites be set free. So Moses went into Pharaoh and said, let my people go so they can worship me. But Pharaoh was like, nah, I'm good. And God was like, oh, okay. Moses, show Pharaoh a miracle to convince him. And Moses was like, nah, I'm good. See, Moses was a humble man who knew he wasn't very eloquent or persuasive. So he asked his brother Aaron to persuade Pharaoh instead. And so God gave Aaron the ability to perform miracles as well. So Moses and Aaron went back into Pharaoh, and Aaron convinced Pharaoh to let the Israelites go. But when he realized the Israelites weren't coming back to help build his economy, he changed his mind and pursued them with his army. In short, the reason Moses waited to part the Red Sea was because he was a normal person who procrastinated and avoided conflict, and needed God to nudge him along in order to accomplish his purpose. But as the Israelites were running for their lives, Moses finally decided to listen and trust God. And when he did, he experienced the greatest victory of his life. Now, we don't know exactly how old Moses was when he led the Israelites out of Egypt, but according to the calculations of Dr. James B. Jordan, professor of biblical studies at Covenant Theological Seminary, Moses was probably around 80 years old when this happened. You see, the Bible says that Moses was 40 years old when he killed the Egyptian, and then he lived in Midian for 40 years, and then he was 80 when he went back to Egypt to confront Pharaoh. So if we accept this calculation, Moses was pretty much at the twilight of his life when he performed the greatest miracle of his life, proving that it's never too late to start chasing your dreams. But while Moses is remembered for parting the Red Sea, before that moment, he was known for being a reluctant leader. You see, when God first approached Moses and told him to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, his response was, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? I'm not even a great speaker. But God said, I will be with you, and these will be the signs that will show that it is indeed I who have sent you. Despite receiving these reassurances, Moses still protested. When God told him to throw his staff down, he didn't immediately obey. Instead, he argued that perhaps Aaron, his brother, would be more qualified for the task. It was until God spoke to him a third time and performed the miracle of turning his staff into a snake that Moses agreed to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. Now, most people hear this story and assume that Moses simply lacked confidence in himself, but I think there's something deeper going on here. You see, Moses grew up in the court of Egypt and was raised by Pharaoh's daughter. In fact, the Bible tells us that he was well-spoken and highly educated, so he probably thought that in order to lead the Israelites, he needed to earn Pharaoh's respect and convince him to allow the Israelites to go. But time and time again, Pharaoh refused. And so Moses realized that in order to free his people, he couldn't rely on his own abilities, but rather he had to put his trust in God. And that's what makes Moses' story so unique. We typically view leaders as being strong, confident individuals who don't doubt themselves. But this isn't how Moses started off. At the beginning of his story, he was a conflicted leader who doubted his abilities and felt inadequate for the task. Yet despite his doubts and fears, he listened to God and put his trust in him, and that's why he was able to accomplish things that seemed impossible. But even though Moses was willing to listen to God, he still struggled to understand God's plan. For example, when God instructed him to kill a lamb and smear its blood above the door to protect the Israelites from the angel of death during the Passover, Moses questioned how he was supposed to do this. His question shows that he likely assumed God would only use him to deliver Israel through military means. So when God told him to sacrifice a lamb, he was confused. But once he understood the Passover laws, he followed God's instructions. And then there was the time when Moses led the Israelites to Mount Sinai. After receiving the 10 Commandments from God, Moses spent 40 days and 40 nights on the mountain with God. In his absence, the people became impatient and built a golden calf to worship. When Moses came down the mountain and saw what they had done, he became angry and broke the commandments. Again, Moses questioned what he was supposed to do next, and God told him to build a new set of tablets and to write the 10 Commandments again. Through these stories, we see that Moses was a man who genuinely wanted to do God's work, but he often struggled to comprehend how he was supposed to do it. But no doubt the biggest challenge Moses faced was leading his people through the wilderness. You see, after leaving Mount Sinai, the Israelites complained so much about their circumstances that God told Moses he would only let them enter the promised land if he gave them a new leader. At this point, Moses was already 80 years old, so it's understandable why he would feel disappointed and discouraged. But instead of complaining and questioning God's plan, he began to pray. He prayed that God would forgive his people and allow them to enter the promised land. Through his prayers, we see that Moses was a man who understood the importance of humility and seeking God's guidance. Overall, the story of Moses teaches us that great leaders aren't always confident and knowledgeable. Sometimes they're regular people who struggle to understand what they're supposed to do. But as long as they're willing to listen, learn, and grow, they can accomplish extraordinary things. So what's the lesson here? Well, if you want to be a great leader, you don't have to have all the answers. In fact, it's okay to admit when you don't know something. Just make sure you're willing to learn and grow. So who wants to hear another amazing story about an ordinary person doing extraordinary things?